April 16th, 1945. A sunny spring morning in the cultural heart of Germany. If you stood on the cobblestone road leading out of Weimar that day, you would have witnessed a surreal procession. You would see the city's elite, men in pinstripe suits and silk ties, women in heavy fur coats, wearing lipstick and high heels. They were chatting. They were adjusting their hats. Some were even smiling. It looked like the intermission of an opera or a garden party for the wealthy. But they weren't going to a party. They were marching at gunpoint. Flanking this column of aristocrats were American soldiers, dirty, exhausted, and grim-faced, with their fingers resting on the triggers of their M1 Garands. These soldiers weren't smiling. They were escorting the cream of the crop 5 miles uphill, toward a place the citizens swore they knew nothing about, a place whose smoke had drifted over their gardens for 8 years. Buchenwald. As they walked, the citizens complained. They covered their noses with perfumed handkerchiefs. They worried about the dust on their polished shoes. They called it a silly American prank. They believed they were innocent. But General George S. Patton had a different opinion. 2 days earlier, the general, known as Old Blood and Guts, had walked through the gates of that camp. He had seen the zoo the SS built for their amusement while children starved yards away. He had seen the piles of corpses stacked like firewood, and the sight had broken him. In his diary, he wrote a sentence that defined the moment. "I have never felt so sick in my life. This is not war. This is madness." When he heard the citizens of Weimar claim, "Wir haben nichts gewusst," we knew nothing, Patton snapped. He decided that the innocence of Weimar was a lie, and he was going to destroy it. He wanted to take the most sophisticated people in Europe and rub their noses in the raw sewage of their own history. They said they didn't see. Fine. He would force them to look. This is the story of the parade of shame. It is the story of how the city of poets was forced to confront the factory of death next door, and the day the smiles were wiped off the faces of the German elite forever. The war in Europe was in its final convulsive weeks, but on the streets of Weimar the sun was shining. The procession moving through the city streets was composed of roughly 1,000 of the wealthiest and most influential citizens of the cultural capital. The men wore tailored suits, silk ties, and pressed fedoras. The women were dressed in heavy fur coats. Despite the spring warmth, their lips painted with fresh red lipstick, their hair perfectly coiffed. They walked in small groups, chatting idly and exchanging glances. Some even smiled, adjusting their collars or shielding their eyes from the sun. To the casual eye, they looked as if they were heading to a matinee at the opera house or a garden party at a grand villa. But as the camera pulls back, the illusion shatters. Flanking this column of well-dressed aristocrats were lines of American soldiers from the Third Army. These men were not dressed for a gala. They were covered in the dust and grease of combat, their uniforms stained with the mud of a trek across Germany. Their faces were grim, their jaws set tight. They did not speak to the civilians. They did not return the smiles. Instead, they kept pace with the column, their fingers resting heavily on the triggers of their M1 Garand rifles. This was no social outing. The citizens were not strolling. They were being herded. The contrast was jarring. On one side, the perfume and polish of high society. On the other, the steel and grit of a conquering army. The civilians treated the event with a confused indignity. One man stopped to wipe dust from his dress shoes. A woman complained loudly about the pace. They viewed the march as a nuisance, a strange American administrative error, or perhaps a propaganda stunt designed to humiliate them. They seemed to believe that if they simply played along with this garden walk, they would be home in time for tea. They had no idea that the road did not lead to a reception hall. It led 5 miles uphill toward the wooded slope of the Ettersberg. The Americans were escorting the enemy elite toward a destination the citizens claimed didn't exist, to see things they claimed never happened. Why was the U.S. Army marching the soul of German culture at gunpoint? Because General Patton had decided that the time for polite denial was over. To understand the magnitude of the horror, one must first understand the geography of the lie. Weimar was not merely a German city, it was a symbol. For centuries it stood as the gleaming sanctuary of German humanism, the self-proclaimed soul of Germany. This was the home of Goethe and Schiller, a city of manicured parks, grand libraries, and Baroque theaters. It was the birthplace of the Bauhaus movement and the site where the German Constitution was drafted. The citizens of Weimar viewed themselves as the guardians of Western civilization, a people devoted to philosophy, music, and high art. Yet, starting in 1937, a different kind of institution was built on the wooded slopes of the Ettersberg Hill, just 5 miles from the city center. While the citizens of Weimar attended symphonies and discussed literature, the SS established Buchenwald. It was not a hidden outpost in the remote east, it was a neighbor. The camp became a massive industrial complex of detention and death, housing tens of thousands of prisoners. For 8 years, the two worlds, the city of poets and the city of prisoners, existed in a symbiotic, terrifying rhythm. The physical connection between the town and the camp was undeniable. The SS officers who ran the torture chambers did not live in isolation. They rented villas in Weimar's leafy suburbs. Their wives shopped in the city's high-end boutiques and sat in its cafes. The camp commander's staff drove the short road down the hill to attend the same opera performances as the university professors and bankers. The economy of the camp bled into the economy of the town. Despite this intimacy, when the U.S. Third Army rolled in, the civilian population maintained a rigid defense. Their response to every inquiry was identical. Wir haben nichts gewusst. We knew nothing. They claimed the camp was simply a labor facility for criminals. They insisted the emaciated men seen working on the nearby rail lines were volunteers. They constructed a psychological wall to match the barbed wire on the hill, but the environment itself testified against them. Buchenwald possessed a crematorium that ran continuously. When the wind blew from the northwest, a distinct heavy smoke drifted down from the Ettersberg. It carried the acrid, greasy stench of burning flesh, blanketing the cobblestone streets and the manicured gardens. The ash from the chimneys did not vanish. It settled on the window ledges of the grand houses and coated the windshields of the luxury cars. To live in Weimar was to breathe the air of Buchenwald. Yet, until the Americans arrived with their rifles, the citizens simply wiped the ash away and looked the other way. On April 15, 1945, General George S. Patton arrived at the gates of Buchenwald. He traveled in a command jeep, accompanied by General Omar Bradley, expecting to inspect a captured prison camp. Patton was a man forged in the violence of the 20th century. He had commanded tanks in the First World War, driven the Wehrmacht out of North Africa, and ruthlessly pushed the Third Army across the frozen fields of the Battle of the Bulge. He was nicknamed Old Blood and Guts for a reason. He had walked through field hospitals filled with severed limbs and surveyed battlefields littering with thousands of dead soldiers without flinching. He believed he was immune to the horrors of war. He was wrong. As Patton stepped out of his vehicle, the reality of Buchenwald hit him not as a tactical situation, but as a sensory assault. The first thing he encountered was the smell, a thick, cloying stench of decomposition and dysentery that clung to the uniforms of the liberators. He walked past the electrified barbed wire and encountered the little camp, the quarantine zone where prisoners had been left to die. He saw men who had been reduced to 60 pounds, their skin stretched translucent over protruding bones, their eyes bulging from skulls that looked more dead than alive. He moved deeper into the complex. He walked past the bear pit and the eagle cage, a zoo constructed by the SS for the amusement of their wives and children, situated mere yards from the execution wall. The juxtaposition of a playground and a slaughterhouse stopped the general in his tracks. Then he reached the courtyard. Piled on a trailer were naked, emaciated corpses, their limbs tangled in a chaotic heap of yellowed skin and bruises. They had been stacked like cordwood, waiting for the ovens that had run out of fuel in the final days. Patton, the iron-willed commander who famously slapped a shell-shocked soldier for crying, physically recoiled, his face drained of color. He turned away from his staff, walked to a corner of the yard, and retched. He refused to enter the barracks where the stench was strongest, stating he would become ill if he did. Later that day, he retreated to his quarters, but he could not shake the images. He picked up his pen and wrote a frantic entry in his diary, capturing the moment his world view shattered. "I have never felt so sick in my life," he wrote. "This is not war. This is madness." The shock quickly hardened into a cold, directed fury. Patton emerged from his quarters and sought out the American officer in charge of the camp's liberation. He pointed toward the valley below, where the church steeples of Weimar poked through the trees. He asked a simple, sharp question. "Do the people in that town know what happened here?" The commander replied that the civilians claimed total ignorance. They insisted they had no idea what happened behind the fences. Patton's jaw tightened. He did not accept the answer. He slammed his riding crop against his boot. In his eyes, the proximity of the camp to the city made ignorance impossible. It made it a lie. If they claimed they did not know, it was because they had chosen not to look. He decided then and there to revoke that choice. He issued a command that appeared in no field manual. He ordered the provost marshal to go into the city of Weimar immediately. He did not want a report. He wanted the citizens. He ordered the military police to round up 1,000 of the city's most prominent figures and march them up the hill. They were coming to Buchenwald. The order moved down the chain of command with brutal efficiency. Within the hour, the peace of Weimar's cobblestone streets was broken by the roar of American jeeps and the heavy tread of military police boots. The MPs did not disperse randomly. They carried specific instructions from General Patton's headquarters. They were not looking for the common laborer, the street sweeper, or the factory worker. They were hunting the aristocracy. The soldiers bypassed the working-class tenements and drove straight to the leafy, manicured suburbs where the villas stood behind wrought-iron gates. They targeted the heavy oak doors of the city's most prestigious addresses. When the doors opened, the soldiers found the beneficiaries of the Nazi regime: judges, university professors, bankers, and the wives of high-ranking party officials. The confrontation was a clash of two distinct realities: On the doorstep stood the American MPs, combat-hardened, covered in road dust and gripping their rifles. Facing them were the citizens of Weimar, dressed in the comfort of a peaceful afternoon. The Americans delivered the order, "Come with us, now." The reaction from the Germans was not fear, but indignation. They treated the intrusion as a breach of etiquette rather than a military directive. At one residence, a prominent physician refused to leave his hallway. He straightened his lapels and loudly announced his medical credentials, insisting that a man of his stature could not be ordered about by a foreign private. The MP did not argue. He simply shifted the barrel of his M1 Garand toward the door. The doctor stopped speaking and reached for his coat. In the commercial district, businessmen were pulled from their offices. They checked their pocket watches with theatrical annoyance, complaining that this interruption would ruin their afternoon schedules. They acted as if they were being summoned for a routine administrative meeting or a minor scolding. The women of the elite class took the most time to prepare. Believing they were going to a public assembly, they dressed for the occasion. They donned heavy fur coats, despite the mild spring weather. They applied fresh lipstick and pinned their hair. Some even packed small picnic baskets, anticipating a long wait in a town square or a lecture hall. They called out to their neighbors as they were herded onto the street, exchanging confused but bemused glances. The mood on the street corner was light, almost festive. The gathered crowd chatted amongst themselves, speculating on the Americans' intentions. They smiled at the war correspondents' cameras, striking poses of defiance and sophistication. They dusted off their sleeves and looked down their noses at the grim-faced soldiers herding them into formation. To them, this was a silly game, a crude display of American power that they would simply have to endure for an afternoon before returning to their opera tickets and their dinner reservations. They had no concept of the destination. They saw the jeeps and the guns, but they did not see the reality. They believed their status protected them. They gathered in the sunlight, the cream of the crop, unaware that they were about to be marched out of their century, out of their civilization, and into the mud of the Ettersberg. The column of 1,000 civilians stretched out along the road leaving Weimar, a snake of black wool and fur winding its way toward the tree line. As the city buildings faded behind them, the terrain began to change. The paved streets gave way to the country road leading up the Ettersberg, the famous hill where Goethe had once sat under an oak tree to write poetry. The incline was steep. The casual stroll quickly turned into a physical exertion. For the first mile, the air was filled with the low hum of conversation. The citizens adjusted their coats and wiped sweat from their foreheads, still treating the march as a tedious imposition. They glanced at their watches. They muttered complaints about the dust settling on their polished shoes. But as the march dragged into its second hour, the atmosphere began to curdle. The soldiers flanking them did not respond to their questions. The jeeps driving alongside them kicked up gravel, their engines the only mechanical sound in the deepening woods. The familiar landmarks of their daily lives, the cathedral spires, the university roofs, disappeared into the valley below. Then the wind shifted. It came down from the summit, rushing through the pines and hitting the front of the column with the physical force of a blow. It carried a scent that defied easy description, a smell that was distinct from the ordinary odors of war or agriculture. It was heavy, greasy, and sweet. It was the smell of old death, of thousands of decomposing bodies, mixed with the acrid chemical stench of the crematoriums that had been running day and night for years. It coated the back of the throat and stuck to the lining of the nose. The reaction was immediate. The chatter in the ranks stopped as if cut by a knife. The smiles that had been flashed at the cameras earlier vanished. Women in the front rows faltered, their hands flying to their faces. They pulled out lace handkerchiefs and silk scarves, dousing them in perfume and pressing them frantically against their noses and mouths. Men stopped in their tracks, looking around into the dense forest as if trying to locate the source of the miasma. The denial that had sustained them in the city began to crack under the sensory assault. In the town square, they could claim ignorance. Here, on the road, the air itself testified against them. Some of the marchers gagged, doubling over by the side of the road. The American MPs did not allow them to linger. The soldiers stepped in, using the stocks of their rifles to prod the civilians back into line. "Keep moving," they shouted, gesturing up the hill. "No stopping." The leisurely pace of the garden walk was gone. The Americans forced the pace, driving the column deeper into the stench. The elite of Weimar, now silent and pale, clutched their coats tighter and lowered their heads, marching relentlessly toward the source of the smoke. The road leveled off. The dense tree line of the Ettersberg broke, revealing a vast, flat expanse, surrounded by high fences and watchtowers. The column of civilians, breathless from the climb and clutching their scented handkerchiefs, arrived at the main gatehouse. Embedded in the wrought iron of the gate was an inscription, positioned so that it could be read by those inside looking out. It read, "Jedem das Seine," to each his own. It was a cruel Bauhaus-style slogan, a final psychological torment implying that the suffering inside was a matter of justice. The 1,000 citizens of Weimar, still wearing their fedoras and furs, passed beneath these iron letters. They stepped across the threshold and entered the concentration camp. The first thing they encountered was not the dead, but the living. Thousands of liberated prisoners had gathered near the entrance. They stood behind the inner barbed wire fences, a mass of striped uniforms and shaved heads. These were the men the citizens claimed did not exist. The volunteers, they claimed, were simply working at a factory. The silence was absolute. There was no shouting. The prisoners did not scream at their neighbors. They did not throw stones or rush the fence in a fit of vengeance. They simply stood there. They were wraith-like figures, men whose bodies had consumed their own muscle for fuel. Their cheekbones protruded sharply, their eyes were sunken deep into their skulls, appearing unnervingly large. Some were too weak to stand and leaned against the wooden posts or sat in the mud, tracking the procession with their eyes. The contrast between the two groups was grotesque. On one side of the wire stood the cultural aristocracy of Europe, plump, well-fed, dressed in wool and silk, their skin flushed with health. On the other side stood the skeletons, covered in rags and sores, their skin yellowed by jaundice and starvation. The civilians slowed their pace, their formation wavering. They tried to look ahead, at the ground, anywhere but at the fence. But the sheer volume of the spectators forced them to look. The prisoners stared back with a terrifying blank intensity. It was the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen the end of the world. They watched the women in their fur coats and the men in their tailored suits with a gaze that stripped away every pretension of civilization. The American soldiers did not intervene. They formed a cordon, forcing the civilians to walk the gauntlet between the rows of silent accusers. The silence of the prisoners was louder than any accusation. It was a physical weight. Under that collective gaze, the citizens of Weimar stopped adjusting their hats. They stopped chatting. They huddled closer together, shrinking away from the wire, realizing for the first time that the barrier was not there to protect the prisoners from them, but to protect them from the reality they had ignored for 8 years. They were no longer the audience at a garden party. They were the exhibits in a museum of guilt. The tour moved past the barracks and the parade ground, funneling the civilians toward the epicenter of the camp's operations, the crematorium courtyard. The American soldiers tightened their cordon, shoulder to shoulder, leaving the citizens no avenue of escape. They were being herded into a confined space, a cobblestone yard dominated by a brick building with a tall, blackened chimney. In the center of this courtyard sat a large, wooden-sided farm trailer. It was parked casually, as if waiting for a tractor to haul a harvest. But the harvest was already there. The trailer was piled high with the naked bodies of prisoners who had died of starvation or typhus in the days before the liberation. There were dozens of them, thrown together in a chaotic tangle of limbs. The bodies were skeletal, the skin stretched tight over rib cages that looked like washboards. Their joints were swollen, their eyes staring open and unseeing at the spring sky. There was no dignity in the arrangement. They were stacked like cordwood, a mass of yellowed skin and bruises, waiting for ovens that had run out of fuel. The citizens of Weimar stopped cold. The momentum of the march collapsed. This was the confrontation Patton had engineered. There was no way to look past it. There was no way to claim it was a factory or a hospital. The sheer industrial scale of the death was parked directly in front of them. The silence of the march was broken by the sounds of physical distress. Men in tailored suits gagged and turned away, retching into the dirt. Women buried their faces in their coats, sobbing uncontrollably. But the military police did not allow them to look away. If a man turned his back, a soldier grabbed his shoulder and spun him around, forcing his gaze back to the trailer. "Look," they commanded. "Look at what you did." The psychological dam broke. Near the front of the group, a woman in a heavy fur coat, who had spent the march complaining about the dust, stared at the tangled limbs in the trailer. Her complexion went white. She began to shake violently. Her knees buckled, and she fainted, collapsing face first into the mud of the courtyard, her expensive coat soaking up the filth of the camp. An American MP stepped forward. He did not offer her a hand. He did not call for a medic. He nudged her with the toe of his combat boot. "Get up," he barked, his voice devoid of sympathy. "You haven't seen anything yet." Most history channels skip the ugly parts. We don't. If you believe the truth must be told, no matter how ugly, hit that subscribe button. Help us keep history alive. Now, let's step inside the torture room. The MPs forced the column forward, steering them away from the open air of the courtyard and into the claustrophobic confines of the camp's administrative buildings. They were marched into the pathology block. Here, the horror shifted from the chaotic brutality of the body piles to something far colder, calculated, clinical sadism. Inside the lab, the American soldiers had arranged a display on a large central table laid out like items in a department store window or artifacts in a museum. Patton had ordered this specific exhibit to ensure the civilians understood the depth of the depravity. He wanted them to see that Buchenwald was not merely a prison where people died of neglect. It was a place where they were harvested. The citizens of Weimar, crowded around the table, pressed forward by the soldiers behind them. They stared at the objects. There were two shrunken heads, the preserved remains of Polish prisoners mounted on wooden bases. Next to them were pieces of tanned human skin excised from the bodies of inmates. The skin displayed intricate tattoos, sailing ships, eagles, names of loved ones. These were the trophies of the SS. They were the specific requests of Ilse Koch, the camp commandant's wife, who was known to ride her horse through the camp, selecting prisoners with interesting ink to be killed so their skin could be fashioned into book covers, gloves, and lampshades for her home. The reaction in the room was absolute disintegration. The detached, civilized demeanor of the German elite evaporated completely. Men in pinstripe suits, who had maintained their composure on the march up the hill, began to weep openly. Several turned to the corners of the room and vomited. The women turned their faces away, burying them in the shoulders of their husbands, but the soldiers shouted at them to turn back. "Look," they commanded, "this is what you supported." An American officer, fluent in German, stood by the table. He gestured to the lampshades. "You say you didn't know?" he asked the trembling crowd. "These were made here in your backyard, while you went to the theater, while you drank your coffee." The denial had been stripped away. They were naked in their guilt. But the tour was not over. As the group shuffled toward the exit, a figure emerged from the shadows of the barracks. He was a former prisoner, a man reduced to a walking skeleton, his striped uniform hanging off his frame like a shroud. He moved with a slow, shuffling gait, his eyes fixed on a well-dressed man in the center of the civilian group, a prominent local banker. The prisoner did not attack. He simply stopped and raised a shaking, bony finger pointing directly at the banker's chest. "I remember you," the prisoner rasped, his voice dry and brittle. "I worked at the train station details. I saw you on the platform. You saw me. You saw us being loaded." He paused, his finger not wavering. "You looked away." The accusation hit the banker with the force of a physical blow. The anonymity of the crowd offered him no protection. He had been identified not as a bystander, but as a witness who chose blindness. The banker's legs gave out. He fell to his knees on the concrete floor, clutching his hat, his body heaving with sobs. He stammered, "I didn't know, over and over again, but his voice lacked conviction. In that room, surrounded by the skin of the murdered and the eyes of the dying, nobody believed him. Not the soldiers, not the prisoners, and, finally, not even himself. The descent from the Ettersberg was a silent procession. The sun was still shining on the German countryside, but the mood of the column had been irrevocably altered. The 1,000 citizens of Weimar walked back toward their beautiful city, but the garden party atmosphere of the morning had vanished. There was no more chatting about the weather. There were no more complaints about dusty shoes. The smiles that had greeted the cameras on the ascent were gone, replaced by faces ashen with shock. The women, who had marched up the hill with perfect hair and fresh lipstick, walked down with mascara streaked across their cheeks. Their expensive fur coats hanging heavy and smelling of the camp's smoke. The men, who had puffed out their chests with indignation hours earlier, now walked with their heads bowed, staring at the pavement. They returned to the city of Goethe and Schiller, but the architecture looked different to them now. Every time they looked up at the wooded hill on the horizon, they no longer saw a scenic landscape. They saw the chimney. They saw the faces behind the wire. The ghost of Buchenwald had followed them home. The impact of Patton's forced tour was immediate and lethal. That evening, as the citizens returned to their villas, the weight of the revelation proved too heavy for some to bear. The bubble of denial had not just been popped, it had been obliterated. Faced with the undeniable proof of their own complicity, the guilt turned inward. In the days following the tour, a wave of suicides swept through the upper crust of Weimar. Several prominent citizens who had spent the war claiming ignorance took their own lives rather than live with the reflection they saw in the mirror. They realized that their culture, their education, and their refinement had failed to stop them from becoming accomplices to monstrosity. When told of the deaths, Patton did not offer condolences. He reportedly remarked that perhaps the rest of them would learn. The ripple effect of the parade of shame reached the highest levels of the Allied command. When Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower heard what Patton had done, he did not reprimand the general for mistreating civilians. Instead, he recognized the strategic necessity of the act. Eisenhower visited the camps himself and realized that future generations would try to erase these crimes from history. He sent an urgent cable to Washington and London with a new order. Send the witnesses. Eisenhower commanded that journalists, editors, members of the U.S. Congress, and British parliamentarians be flown to Germany immediately. He wanted the world to see what the citizens of Weimar had seen. He famously stated that he wanted to gather enough evidence so that, if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda, he would have the first-hand testimony to crush the lie. He forced the Germans to be the primary witnesses against themselves. The forced tour of Buchenwald remains a defining moment in the history of accountability. It stripped away the comfortable excuse of, "I didn't know." Patton demonstrated that ignorance in the face of industrial evil is not a defense, it is a choice. The citizens of Weimar were not the ones pulling the levers of the gas chambers or firing the rifles, but they were the ones who looked away. They were the ones who stayed silent while the ash fell on their gardens. On that day in April 1945, Patton forced them to open their eyes, and in doing so, he passed a verdict that echoes to this day. Silence is complicity. Patton taught the civilians a psychological lesson, but soon American soldiers would teach the SS guards a much bloodier physical lesson at a camp called Dachau. We are covering that story of brutal revenge next. Subscribe so you don't miss it.